Hi, I'm Janice Switlow, and welcome to Season 2 of my episodes of Switlow Sheds the Light. Again, I want to thank briefly Cackling Cactus Curiosities for generously allowing the film crew here to do this in their premises. They have lots of wonderful, weird things and oddities and curiosities, so I encourage you, if you're in the area, to drop by. So I want to start this season off talking about something that was no surprise to me. And that was when Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, announced that he was buying a pipeline. All the commentaries at the time found this a shock. It came out of, the blue kind of thing. But for me, as I said, it was no surprise. Why? Because I had informed and put the Crown on notice, on proper notice, using actual terms that apply in a treaty relationship. And there were two things that I pointed out directly to the Crown, to the Queen. And that, sorry, someone had asked, what's the Crown? Well, the Crown is an easy way to refer to the holder of the King or Queen position. And since it's a constitutional monarchy, we often, lawyers especially, referring to the King or Queen of the time, refer to that entity as the Crown. So I had informed the Queen of two things that were going on with her government in Canada. And that was, one, the intention for the federal government to pass the framework law. This was an act which Trudeau had announced and Minister Bennett had announced, was intending to put in place legislative framework for Indigenous rights, just another term for Aboriginal rights, which is a concept defined by the Section 35 doctrine. So there was that. They were just going to go ahead and pass legislation. And secondly, there was talk about the pipeline being expanded. Now, I did two things in that relatively short notice. And that was because, of course, in dealing with your partner, you're always dealing in a helpful manner. In other words, you're acting and speaking and conducting oneself diplomatically with a view to warning, a view to ensuring that the relationship is not undermined by those who are not perhaps fully aware of what the relationship requires, or alternatively, as the case in Canada's governments, acting as outlaw nation. So after Trudeau was, and why was this an issue? Immediately after this was issued, Trudeau was called to London to speak with the Queen. Now, keep in mind, people say, well, the Queen has no more power, but think about that. She is able to call in to see her the head of government, which in the case of Canada is the Prime Minister, and that she did. And when he returned from that trip, and coincidentally or not, I like to think not, he immediately announced that he was buying the pipeline. Why is this? What was it that I said that triggered this course of action? Well, first of all, the treaties are very clear on who can take up. The treaties only allow for Her Majesty, her governments, and her subjects to be able to take up. A company is not a subject of the Crown. It's not the Queen's subject. It's trite to say that a company is an artificial entity created under legislation, domestic legislation, and often incorporated in outside jurisdictions in other parts of the world. And it's trite to say that those companies owe no loyalty to the Queen. They don't vote. There is nothing connecting them to the Crown. Compare that to a Crown corporation. That's an arm of the Crown operating as a corporate entity that is accountable to the Crown. Subjects, that goes without saying, are her subjects. So when she was granted, through the treaties, the ability to exercise partial political sovereignty governing her subjects. There were no permissions granted to anyone else. There were no other countries, for instance, through those treaties. So these companies that have come in and created mines and built pipelines, these are not lawful taking up of land that's governed by treaty. So, pointing out, of course, that the existing pipeline was not lawful. Can you imagine the implications for investors in Canada? And this is why I haven't really gone public with it before, because I'm conscious of trying to protect Canada, but in the sense of, if Canada does well, theoretically, Indigenous nations should do well, because there's supposed to be a sharing of that. But we can no longer ignore the fact that it's not simple for land in this part of the world to be used for certain purposes. And imagine the difference between her governments having to come up with the financing and wherewithal and ability to build mines, to construct pipelines, all these sorts of things. There would be less taking up and there would be much more compliance with protecting those lands, for example, from not being environmentally desecrated. A tenant cannot destroy the premises they're renting. They must be maintained. And these are all requirements on the Crown, and if her governments take up, and if her subjects take up. But companies, to repeat, have no innate authority to do anything with the land that continues to be, the underlying title continues to be in the hands of Indigenous nations. The other thing with the Framework Act being torpedoed, by pointing out that you really cannot enforce and oppress another nation's governance. You can't dictate. Canada could not pass laws that go even further interfering with Indigenous government. However, the response to that one is whereby you have Canada now and the provinces getting chiefs to sign into the framework process and execute a framework agreement with the federal government and a framework agreement with the province, and then a framework implementing agreement. Having been warned once, you can't interfere, now they've resorted to the old tactic of manufacturing consent, manufacturing that this is what's sought, because the Crown was clear. Her governments cannot do what they want to do. They need to satisfy that they've obtained, that they're responding to the needs as determined by the Indigenous nations themselves. So as a good partner, when the Indigenous nations say, this is what we need from your governments, Your Majesty, then her governments can act. However, we know full well that what the Canadian government has in mind and what has been sped up incrementally, incredibly, by the Trudeau government, Trudeau Jr., is not what the Indigenous nations actually want. And compounding this outlaw nation, again, is this effort to try to create an illusion of something that doesn't exist. So again, the pipeline, Trudeau bought it because a Crown corporation is the only entity that can actually act on behalf of the Crown and is part of the Crown. Companies from outside, any company, whether incorporated in Canada within provincial or federal laws, or outside incorporation and registered to practice business in Canada, none of that works. There are so many examples of lands that have been unlawfully taken up. And what's the consequence of that? Well, in restitution, there's a concept called waiver of tort. And what it results in is that every single dollar earned, not net, gross, any money that anyone has unlawfully thus obtained from this unlawful taking up of lands accrues to and belongs to and is restitution that is payable to the indigenous nations. You can imagine what that adds up to. I've tested this concept, by the way, because another unlawful taking up was when they built the railway across Canada. They also took up land to build hotels. Well, that was not authorized by the Railway Act. So when I brought forward that, by the way, all these nice fancy hotels in all the main cities, the Vancouver Hotel, all that are now Fairmont hotels, they, quite frankly, are still owned, and can be taken over by the indigenous nations. The reaction, the people weren't ready to roll on that, unfortunately, and they were kind of scared. But the railway acted fast. They sold off all the hotels. So we know this stuff works. I know emphatically it works. But if you don't trigger it properly, you're just a domestic ethnic minority, and you have nothing to say or do about what takes place. The next few episodes, I encourage you to sort of watch in a row, because they're all going to kind of build on each other. There's a number of aspects of what I've touched upon today that will come forward and be emphasized in later episodes. Thank you for your time. Welcome to Season 2, and I hope to meet your acquaintance. Thank you.